Hello to my fellow history lovers and people that think if I learn something new, it'll be a good day. So I am going to talk to you again about this idea of whether it is unpatriotic or un-American, un-German, or un-Rwandan to study the dark parts of a country's history, because I think there's a lot of nuances and I'm always trying to think my way through this. So four things happened. This is going to be kind of long that I'm going to throw at you and then see if you put it together and see if you come out differently than I do. So one is I have a friend from Costa Rica and she and her husband are going to visit Africa. And part of it is to go to Rwanda. I think there's a waterfall there. And the tour organizer said, oh, when you're there, you should spend an afternoon at the Rwandan Genocide Museum. And my friend and her husband were like, no way, it would be too sad. We don't want it to be depressed. It's like a getaway. We don't want to go. And the interesting thing was the woman who was the tour organizer said, we don't see it that way. You know, we see it as honoring how far we've come. So the Rwandan genocide was 1994. All right, keep that in your mind. Number two, my husband, who was actually just sitting here trying to read his book, and I said, you know, I told him that story, and I said, you know, this whole thing about like, is it unpatriotic to study the darker parts of our history and the Rwandan Genocide Museum, because we're both friends with the people going. And he said, well, it's kind of interesting that tour guide's takeaway, because he said, when I visited the Museum of Slavery, it's in Mobile, Alabama. That's the colloquial name. I think it's the Legacy Museum is the actual name. He said, I cried. And I was surprised because my husband and I have been married over 30 years and he doesn't cry easily. He's from a farm. He's a corporate lawyer, very clear-eyed, very calm, you know, got to assess the situation. And I said, well, what made you cry? And he said, I think it was what humanity could do to each other, like two humans could do to each other. He said it was really pretty devastating. And that as he walked away, his thought is, we need to know this to make sure it doesn't happen again. So put that in the back of your mind. That's number two. Here's number three. I have a friend from Germany, and she's maybe 10 years younger than I am. And she said, she told me once that being German, you carry a little bit of guilt that, you know, your country, Germany, responsible for the Holocaust. She said, you do kind of carry that with you a little bit being German. All right, that's my first three stories. So now I call up my older son, and he's actually trying to get out the door to rugby, but, you know, I'm like, I just throw all this at him. I'm like, kind of, what do you think about the unpatriotic, un-American, studying the dark parts of history? And his initial reaction was, well, I don't know. He said, I suppose there's an age issue. He said, if you're fourth grade, you kind of want heroes and villains. You probably don't have the bandwidth to really understand the sort of intermediate ground. But he said, by the time you're in high school, you probably need to know it all. So then I said, what about, and I just read recently about Stollensteiner. I think it's Stollensteiner. If you speak German, correct me, probably massacring it, the Stollensteiner project. And the idea was, in Germany, in a lot of buildings, there's placards, and they will say if a family was taken there. So if a Jewish family was taken in the Holocaust to Auschwitz, you see their names, like this is where a family lived that was taken. And I said, what do you think about that? And he said, well, he goes, I don't know. He said, nobody alive today in Germany did any of those things. And he said, the government is totally different. So he goes, I don't know. I'm not sure like about it. I don't know, Mom. And then he added, Mom, I really got to get to practice. So thank you for sharing as much as you did. And that's my fourth story. But here's where I was thinking after all those phone calls and talks is, I don't know that this is really about being American, Rwandan, or German. What I think it is in each of these cases, what you're doing is you're looking at, it is possible for humans, human nature, that when you feel threatened, when you see someone as the other and you're worried because of, it could be race, it can be religion, it can be political affiliation, and that worry makes you fearful. The fearful can bring out violence, which can bring out pretty horrific stuff. And this isn't just America, Rwanda, and Germany. You can look at any country. This is China, this is Russia. You know, everywhere in the world, we have a danger that when we as humans look at another human and think of them as other, then violence can happen and pretty horrific things. So it occurs to me that maybe the very purpose of studying, whether it's the Slavery Museum in Montgomery, Alabama, the Rwanda Museum, the Stollenstein placards, is not to say our country did something bad or that we're bad because we're Rwandan, America, or German, but that the very purpose is to say we recognize in humanity this propensity, and our whole purpose, the entire purpose, is to set up guardrails, safety rails that for our children's children's children, that we're aware that this is possible, this has happened, and it wasn't because of whatever country you're from. It's because there is within us a little bit of a tendency to do some pretty horrible things without guardrails. And so that's what I think those studying the darker parts of history is not about feeling ashamed for your country. I think it's loving your country enough to think, I want to make sure in my country, long after I'm gone, that my children's children's grandchildren, everyone's children's grandchildren, wouldn't be in a situation like that, because my generation tried to say, hey, the danger's out there. What are we going to do to combat that danger? Anyway, that was my takeaway. I would love to hear yours, and that was really long today. So if you're still here, thank you, and I will see you tomorrow.